Welcome to the Sacred Reclamation Podcast. Here we will be exploring how we can reclaim the sacredness of birth, life, death, and all the happenings in between. My name is Sydney Sands, and my intention with this podcast is to reclaim the art of storytelling. This is a space where we will practice allowing the simple act of telling our stories and listening to the stories of others to be medicine for our bodies and spirits. I invite you to keep an open mind and an open heart as you listen to these stories. Grab a cup of tea, maybe a little snack, and settle in for story time. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to the Sacred Reclamation Podcast. I'm your host, Sydney Sands, and today on the show we have my sweet friend, Natalie Elliot. Thank you so much for coming on, Natalie. I'm so excited to have you here.
Oh, me too.
Natalie and I met in the Radical Birthkeeper School, and then we connected when I was traveling. We connected in person in Ojai when she was living out there. And then we connected again when she was traveling and she came to visit me and Shane out in North Carolina. So our friendship has just been blossoming, and there's been lots of voice messages, and I came on her podcast and now she's on my podcast, and she was a really big inspiration for me, you know, making this dream come to life. And you're also such an inspiration to me in so many other ways. So thank you.
That's so sweet. I feel like I could cry already. You're such an inspiration to me too. I'm so grateful for our sisterhood.
Yeah, it's a really sweet and special friendship.
Yeah.
All right, so I'd love to start with just a little meditation to drop into our bodies before we dive into this conversation and hearing all your beautiful stories. So I'll invite you and anyone who's listening to just start to settle a little bit. Start to notice your breath, get out any wiggles. Just see if you can rein in and calm your energy for a few minutes here. If you are comfortable and feel safe, you can go ahead and close down your eyes. Yeah, let out a little yawn. And begin to deepen your breath. Deep inhales through the nose. Slow, long exhales through the nose or the mouth. Maybe you let out a little sigh on the exhale. And with your next deep breath, send your energy all the way down to your womb space or your sacral chakra. Almost at your root, just above your root. And just notice what's here. Breathe here for a moment. And on your next inhale, pull that energy, your awareness, up to your heart space and breathe here. Noticing what's here, what's present right now. Maybe you want to open up your heart space a little bit. We'll take another inhale in here. And on your exhale, we're going to send the energy back down to our womb space. Really playing with that heart-womb connection here. And just letting it be natural, organic. There's no need to force anything. If there's any resistance, That's okay. And we'll take a few more deep breaths with the inhale, bringing your energy and awareness up to your heart chakra. And with your exhale, guiding it back down to your sacral chakra. And just take a moment to send a little love here, send a little gratitude here. These are two extremely potent and powerful energy centers in our bodies. Just say a little thank you. And take one more goodbye, see you later breath. And when you're ready, come back to now, the space and time here. Maybe moving your body a little bit, taking an energizing, quicker inhale. And start to open your eyes, maybe look around your space, move your body around a little bit, whatever you need to do to end up back here. All right. Thanks, everyone. And now we'll move into setting intentions. I need a moment to let mine surface, but if you have one already bubbling, go ahead and put it out there.
Yeah, I was thinking about this morning. My intention really is to just be here and share honestly and authentically, and to trust that whatever arises is what is meant for us to chat about today. And yeah, I think my intention really is just to remain really present and honest.
Yeah, that's beautiful. My intention today is to really sit in this energy of friendship and sisterhood and abundance and generosity of that energy. And I feel like with me and you, we've experienced in our time together, just exchanging so many things, whether that's words of wisdom or tangible gifts, our little herbal medicine offerings. And I just love the flow of energy that we have in our relationship. So I want to keep that going here, and then also just pop it out into the world of anyone listening. Really let that energy of generosity, abundance, friendship, sisterhood, brotherhood, all of it flow, whatever that means for you.
Aw, I love that. We do have such a sweet, energy exchange between us and our friendship.
Yeah, it's like, almost like a spring. It's just like ever flowing.
Yeah, I totally feel that. Aw.
All right. Well, I'll hand it over to you to introduce yourself. Tell us who you are. If you want to tell us where you are, where you're from, who you're from, what you do, whatever you want to share with us.
Yeah, gosh, that's so many places I could go there. Yeah, I'm Natalie. I am the daughter of Krissa and the granddaughter of Mary, and I love to share that. This necklace I'm wearing, if anyone's watching video, is like the necklace that my grandmother gifted to my mom, my sister, and I. And so that feels really important for me to name that. I really love to bring in who I come from in my mother line. And that really informs a lot of the work I do. So I work with women in a few different capacities, but my main sort of purpose is to support women in reconnecting to their menstrual cycle. And so sometimes that is through working on healing painful periods through very practical diet lifestyle things, but often it's also this deeper connection of living in tune with your cycle and reclaiming that as your way of life. I'm currently in Texas. I'll be heading to Hawaii soon. And as far as where I'm from, kind of like when people ask me that I'm like nowhere. And that's not really true. I grew up in Oklahoma, and that's where I spent most of my um, childhood. But I also lived in two other states before Oklahoma. I went to high school in a different state, and I spent most of my like early adulthood until the past like year in Southern California. And so I often kind of feel more like I'm from Southern California than anywhere else because that's where I really formed my identity.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. It is interesting to think about where we're from and how that influences us or how it doesn't influence us.
Yeah.
Because we don't I don't know. I don't necessarily have a I was born in Kentucky, but I don't really remember. I have like 3 memories of living there.
Mm.
And I would imagine if I moved to different states throughout my childhood, then I would just kind of be, you're just a woman of the world.
Yeah. I do feel like that. I've lived in like, I think I mean, I don't know. I've lived in like at least 5 or 6 different states and like 3 different countries. And so it's like really interesting to have that sort of nomadic background because it is nice in a way. Like I do feel like I can connect with so many different types of people, but I do often envy those people who like grew up in one place and like, for example, I lived with this woman in North Carolina and like she can trace her family back to the exact county that she's in, like generations and generations. And like other people in that area have like streets named after their family.
Yeah.
Like it's just, that's like kind of cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. I've watched this family on YouTube. The YouTube channel is called Justin Rhodes, but he lives on his family farm and he has like 5 kids now. And he was walking to the local cemetery with one of his sons, and they were trying to find who was the oldest Rhodes that was buried there. And he was saying how his family has been there on that land since like 18, I don't remember what year, but the 1800s. And I'm like, that is
Whoa.
so, so cool.
Yeah,
Like,
it
talk about
is.
legacy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Very cool. All right. Well, let's just get right into it. I'll ask you, what do we need to know about you and your life before we drop deeper into your bigger reclamation story and what your message is? Like, are there any stories that jump out to you, whether that's, yeah, any stories that come to you or anything you want to share? Just paint a picture for who you are so we can get to know you and understand your message a little bit more once we get there.
Totally. Yeah. Well, who I am right now, I am someone who lives deeply devoted to my body. Like that is really my most important core value is to tend to my body and to live in tune with my body. And so what that looks like on like a practical day-to-day basis is I live very much in tune with my cycle. So I don't do anything when I'm bleeding. I lay around and I journal and I listen to music and I don't work. And then in my inner spring, after I bleed in my follicular phase, I plan things and I get excited about life again. And in my ovulatory phase, inner summer, I'm in the doing of things and being quite active and being intentional about creating things. And then when I start to come into the premenstrual luteal inner autumn time, I'm slowing down, letting go, reflecting. And I live that way within my cycle and also with the seasons. I was just speaking to the inner seasons of the menstrual cycle. And of course, we have seasons in the earth too. And so I am someone who lives really devoted to following the earth's timing and my body's timing because I believe that my body is earth and that women's bodies like really are earth, like we are doing the same thing that earth is doing, creating something in our bodies every cycle, whether that turns into a baby or whatever it turns into. There's creation energy happening within us. I feed my body temple really devotedly. I'm very intentional about what I eat and nourishing myself well. It's been quite a journey for me over the past 4 years. And yeah, I think that, and I'm just very intentional about the way that I tend to myself and cultivate my relationships and connect to the earth. I would say like I've done so much reflection on like what I'm really here to do. And a big thing that's come from that is like I'm here to help and support others too, and reconnecting to relationship, and reconnecting to food, and reconnecting to the body. And I mean, like, so much like what your podcast even is just like reclaiming what what it is to be a human, which is like a really beautiful, deep, soulful thing. So that's like who I am now, but I definitely have not always been that way. And I can like kind of get into that. Just go for it if you think that's good.
Yeah, yeah, tell us who you were before, what stories that stand out to you that are just like touch points or mile markers in your life before you turned in, or not turned into, but before you really stepped into this full blossoming of yourself. Like, have you always been that way? Have you always been so in tune with your cycle? Have you always been living cyclically?
Yeah, no. Absolutely not. Yeah, it's so interesting when I was reflecting on this. The first thing I want to share is one of my memories is when I was like maybe somewhere between like 10 to 13 years old, like somewhere in that range. I used to like have this catchphrase that I would tell everyone, or two catchphrases. And one of them was, don't tell me what to do. And the other one was, I can do what I want.
Those are like my catchphrases now. That's amazing.
Oh my God. And so I was thinking about it, and I was like, thinking about how I've been on this journey to like reclaiming my life and, making it what I want it to be. And how like, I wasn't like that before. But then I was like, like I think a little seed of that has always been there. Like I always just had this stubbornness. Like if someone told me I couldn't do something, I would do it. Or if someone told me like just like little things, like, oh, Natalie, can you, or like I when I was in middle school, we had to like run 15 laps around the gym in PE class. That was like part of the like warm up we had to do. And I was not a very athletic kid at that time, and I hated running. And so like I would stand on the side, and the PE teacher would be like, Natalie, you have to run. And I would be like, don't tell me what to do. I was like, I'm not going to run. Oh my God.
That is amazing.
Yeah. So I think, and the women in my family are just generally like a bit stubborn. And so I think I have some of that. And like very just spirited, stubborn women. And so I think that I have some really good aspects of that. And of course, I can also come out in like not so great ways. I've had to really learn how to like be flexible and understanding with other people in my life. And that, I'm sure we'll get to it, part of my story too, like reclaiming my like conscious relationships with people. But other than that, though, I grew up like a pretty standard American childhood. Like, when I really think about it, it was, like I watched a lot of TV. We ate fast food. Like, we'd go get McDonald's after school all the time. We ate like canned fruit, and I remember those like Del Monte, I think that's the name of it, like
Yeah.
canned like papaya and like and like those like sugary juices.
The little,
Um
some of them had like the cherry in it. But
yeah,
I
the
don't even think
cherry.
that's a cherry. I don't know what
I
that
don't
is.
know what it is. Like these mixed fruit cans, like that's what I remember. Um and McDonald's. I remember a lot of McDonald's. And I also grew up, and this feels important because of the work I do now. Like I grew up like popping a lot of painkillers, and not like in a, like as a
Mhm.
kid, like it was anytime there was a headache, or like, oh, mom, my back hurts, or my head hurts, or I don't feel good. It's like, oh, we'll take a insert name of pharmaceutical. Um, and I don't think that's necessarily like uncommon. Like I don't think I'm unique in that experience. I think a lot of us who grew up in like the 90s and early 2000s like had that experience.
Mhm.
But I do kind of think it was a bit extreme in my family. Like there was a lot of it, like, oh, we'll just take 3 ibuprofen. Like you have a little headache, take 3 ibuprofen. And I think about that now, and I'm like, whoa, that's kind of wild. Um, yeah. And so I grew up with that. And then I also, I grew up like just with a lack of like consciousness to like how things affected my body. Like food, for example, like there was no connection between like eating McDonald's and like having a stomach ache, for example. Um, or to even go later to my life, like having debilitating period pain and like being on a vegan diet. Like that was when I was in college. So I'm jumping around a little here. But yeah, like there was just like this lack of connection and understanding of like really just being in my body and being connected to that. Um, and I think it was probably like that until things kind of like came to a head. And so I guess what I'll share there is really in relation to my cycle and to my womb and to all of these like really like these things that are really sacred to me now. First of all, I had no idea when my period was going to come. Like on my podcast, I have women share their first period stories. And when I think about like my early cycling years as a girl, like I had no reference point for like, oh, my cycle is always happening and it's however many days, and like I wasn't tracking it. And so every time my period came, it was just kind of like, ah shit, like that was like the whole energy of it. And it's kind of wild to me now that like I had no idea. Like I thought it was just this random thing that happened. And so that was probably what my life was like until college. And I was having really painful periods all this time, like went to the ER a few times even for cramps. But still like no real deeper understanding of like, well, why is this happening? Like, why am I going to the ER? Like, I thought that was just random. And I think that's kind of why I share the stuff about my childhood is like, not to shame my parents or anything, but just to be like, there was no like deeper understanding of like, things don't just happen randomly to your body. Like, it's not just like, oh, all of a sudden this headache or stomach ache comes out of nowhere. Like, there's something that your body's trying to communicate to you, right? Um, so I guess where I want to go with this is I was really afraid to use tampons for most of my life, and this is like an interestingly really big part of my story. I was really afraid of tampons, and but I really wanted to put one in because I thought, that's like what all the cool girls do is like they wear tampons, and you can go swimming if you have a tampon in, and I could go play field hockey because eventually I did get sporty and I played field hockey. um, but I was really afraid, and every time I would try to put one in, I would get lightheaded. Like I would get this like faintness in my head and feel like I was going to pass out. Like I would get hot, and I now recognize that as like a mind body connection response to something, like partly being disembodied and sort of uncomfortable with my own body. But also, I think it was partly my body being like, tampons aren't it, girl, which I'm so grateful for. But I asked friends like so many times. I would ask my girlfriends, like, or even my mom, like, will you help me put it in? Will you just come in and put it in for me? And I'm really proud of little Natalie for asking that question because that's like a really vulnerable thing to ask. But I do think, gosh, there's so many threads I could go on here, but I've always been really comfortable with women. And that's for a lot of reasons. Like I've always been really comfortable with other girls and with women. And I haven't had to deal with like a whole lot of sister wound stuff. But yeah, no one would help me. And so I was kind of left to fend for myself. And it wasn't until I got to college when I finally had a friend who was willing to help me put a tampon in. I still had never put one in. Or actually, it wasn't help me put it in. I had gotten it in. So there was one day I was like sitting in the college dorm room bathroom and I finally got the tampon in, but I was not like on a very heavy day of flow. And the only tampons that my roommate had were like jumbo super tampons. And so I put this tampon in and none of my roommates were home. I had 4 roommates and none of them were home. And immediately once I got it in, I started feeling lightheaded and started feeling I was passing out. And so I called one of my friends, and she didn't even live on campus. She lived like 20 minutes away. But this was such a healing experience for me because the second I called her and I was like, I put a tampon in, I'm freaked out. I don't know what to do. I need to get it out. How do I get it out? She immediately got in her car and started driving to my dorm room and talked me through like getting it out while she was on the phone with me, and then came over.
Oh,
And yeah, it was just like such a healing moment for me. um, I can pause if you want to ask questions, but I could also keep going with another layer of the story.
I mean, that story is so sweet because I'm just imagining like you've asked so many people to so many women to help you with this before, and like it would be so easy for anyone to just be like, "Oh, shut up, like just pull it out," you know? And so for your friend to like to recognize that moment and that you needed support and that you were reaching out for support and for her to like show up in that moment, that does sound just so sweet and healing, and
Mhm.
that sounds like a really sweet friend.
Yeah. Yeah, it was great. I met like some of my best girlfriends in college. I'm so grateful to still be in like deep, meaningful relationship with them. Um, yeah. But yeah, so I mean, I put a tampon in, and then I would say for like a year after that, I continued to use tampons. And I was also becoming a hot yoga teacher at the time. And so it was nice to be able to do it and whatnot. And then at some point in college, I was exploring self pleasure, which I had done since I was a little girl. Like that was always a big part of my journey. Um, but at this particular moment in college, I was exploring self pleasure, and I attempted to put a finger inside my yoni. And even though I had been putting tampons in, the feeling of my internal tissues um, freaked me out so much that I had the same response as I used to have when I put tampons in. I got lightheaded and started um, hot and like started feeling like I was going to faint. And it created a lot of fear in my body for me. Like I was really afraid to touch my body. And I think some people might have just been like, okay, whatever, I'm not going to do that, you know, like didn't like that, not going to do it. But something in me like was like, no, I need to figure out why this is happening. Like, why can I not touch my body? Because sometimes when I've told people this story, not really now because people see me on the work I'm doing and they get it now, but back in the day when I was telling people like I need to figure out why I can't touch my vagina. Like that was like what I would always say. I was like, why can't I touch my vagina? Um, and everyone's like, well, why? Like, why do you need to? Like, what? You know, like, why is that something you're trying to do? And I couldn't tell you then. Like, I was just like, no, like, I think to me, it was like, this is a part of my body. Like, why can I not, how do I not know it? How do I not, yeah, I think somewhere in there, I knew that like this was a really important thing to be in relationship with my body, but specifically this part of my body, like the entrance into my womb, which is like the crux of my life, is living in alignment with my womb now. So um,
Had you
I
can I
go
ask,
ahead.
had
Yeah.
you been sexually active at this time? Like have you are you still yeah, have you had sex before? Have other people touched your vagina or touched your yoni and you had an okay response with that? Is it just that relationship with yourself that caused the physiological reaction?
Yeah. Yeah. It was just myself. I had sex in college for the first time. So I think probably at the time that I had that first initial response of like putting my own finger in my body, I hadn't had sex yet, but I definitely had men's fingers in my body. Um, so that was a really interesting thing too. I think it was more like the sensation that I felt that was
Yeah.
like triggering to me for some reason. And I don't know, I'm sure there's so many different layers for it, but probably some of it is just shame, right? Like thinking that that's not what you're supposed to do. You're not allowed to touch that part of your body, even though other people do. And that was part of the like mind game for me. It was like, well, why can other people do this and I don't respond that way? But when I try to do it, you know, and I was super into feminism and stuff in college. And so that was like a whole thing. And I was like, well, I should be able to touch my body because it's my body.
Yeah, and it's like it is interesting how twisted it is. Like no, this is a dirty, shameful place. Don't touch it. And then it's like, but let men touch it.
Yeah,
But
super weird.
don't you can't touch it. No other women can touch it. Only men, and don't talk about it.
Yeah, well, and it's too, it's so much like, how people, a lot of people go about relationships these days, which is something I've been like super fascinated by lately is like conscious relationship, where like we tend to just like give all of ourselves away in relationship instead of like becoming the version of ourself that like finds another person from a place of wholeness. And so I feel like this like sexual theme is so similar to that. And like we should be the most comfortable with our bodies and have that relationship first before we like introduce someone else to our bodies.
Yeah, instead of having this narrative of like, oh, wait till you're in your 40s and like you'll know what you want, you'll know how to ask for it, like but the other like
No.
20 years of being sexually active, you just have to be in this weird, young, naive, awkward phase. That is like I just wonder how different women and girls would grow up if we were taught like what you just said for
Yeah.
us to cultivate a relationship with ourselves and get to know ourselves before we become in relationship with another person versus yeah, just having all of these years of that and then like, oh, once you're older, there's so many things in our society where people are like, once you're older, you'll figure that out or you can do that when you're older. Like that's for later, way later in your life. It's like
What? Yeah. Well, and it's too like, I've had to move through a lot of shame even just with like how um like sexual I was as a little girl because I think like I carried a lot of shame for that. Like I remember I used to like self-pleasure as like a 10-year-old and almost every time like immediately after it, I would like almost like punish myself, like not on a very literal level, but I would like internally like I would be saying negative things about myself like I can't believe you did that again, you did it again. And I've had to do a lot of work to be like, you know what, like our bodies are ours, like we are born with them, like we are born with these bodies for us. And it is absolutely natural and normal to explore it on your own, and there's like nothing weird about that, which yeah is like gosh a whole thing. um but yeah, so I got really curious in college about like my own, and I wouldn't have even said it, like I didn't have terms like yoni or womb or like sacred cycle woman, like none of that was like in my awareness. Like I was
yeah.
becoming a yoga teacher, and so I did have sort of a spiritual orientation to life, but it was in a very it wasn't in a very like sacred womanhood type way, if that makes sense. It was more about like, meditation and working on my mind, and like yes, I was being in my body and yoga, but I think a lot of it was like focused on like spirituality of the mind at that time. And that was really beautiful. I'm really grateful for that. I think yoga was the gateway to so much for me. But, and I know you can relate to that too. A lot of us
Mm-hmm.
can.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, in the same way that veganism was a gateway to me, even though like it didn't support me long term. But yeah, back to my body stuff. I got really curious about that. And I was still sort of in the medical paradigm. Like I still in college twice went to the ER for period cramps, got morphine, like just crazy things like that. Little to no connection to why that was happening. And I, yeah, I think I graduated college and still had that fear of my body, even though I had begun being sexually active. And it wasn't until probably 2020 when I just, it kind of came to a head. Like I was like, oh, I know what it was. Oh my gosh, this just dropped right in. I started a doula training. So I started a doula training in the end of 2020. And in the doula training handbook, they were talking about perineal massage, which is like the massage of like, kind of between your yoni and your butt hole. And they were talking about like internally massaging that area, which like is like definitely not needed for pregnant women, but that's what they were teaching in it. And reading it, I got lightheaded. I like had to call my roommate in to bring me a glass of water because even just reading about it, I started getting
Mm.
lightheaded and I was like, oh God, like, am I going to be able to do this work? Like, who knows why I was called to be a doula? It would just like dropped in. I was like, okay, I need to be a doula. Um, and yeah, I started reading about that, and just reading about it got me so anxious. And that was kind of the turning point for me. That was my like, something needs to change moment. Like I cannot just keep getting lightheaded with this and like nauseous, right? Because the behind that nauseous, lightheaded, hot feeling is like a disconnect between my mind and my body, like something that is there that's like my ego is trying to protect me from feeling for whatever reason. So at the time, still, I wasn't like super holistic or anything yet. And so I just started Googling. Like I was Googling, like fully outsourcing this knowledge. Like, why can't I touch my vagina? Like that was what I was searching in my Google searches, literally in 2020. And I was like finding, you know, like different like answers.com or whatever, where people ask questions and they're like, what's going on? But it was like everything was like a medical thing. So people were talking about like
Mm.
vaginismus, which is like it's painful to touch your vagina. And I was like, that's not my experience. Like this is a this is like a not like really a physical response that I'm having. It's like something deeper.
You try to like type
But
that into re-describe it into Google, like it's super specific.
I know I got pretty creative with my Google searches back then. But you know what is I'm really grateful that I did those Google searches, and this is one of the times that I'm grateful that our phones listen to us and read everything we're typing, because what ended up happening is I got an Instagram ad one day. An Instagram ad, like when they come up on your stories, it's like not someone you follow, but they come up. And it was for these four women's program. And they were called, their like business was called the Yoni Temple School. And I had no idea what the word yoni meant. But I just like saw it said something about womb and something about, I think the thing that I saw was about like connecting with your yoni. And anyways, I found out yoni meant vagina. It's like the sacred way of saying that. And it's more than just vagina. It's like your whole portal into your womb. But yeah. And so I started following them on Instagram. And that was probably in like the end of summer of 2020. And I had a lot of time to myself because it was lockdown. And they did this like Instagram challenge, this like 30-day challenge. And the four of them, they're not working together anymore. They all kind of do their own different things now. But when they were together, one of them was really into like the psychosomatic womb healing, like very like womb embodiment practices. Another one was an herbalist and a womb massage therapist. Another one of them was really into like sexual practices and tantra. And then another one of them was really into dance. And of course, there was more too. And they were all certified in like yoni steaming and yeah, just all of these beautiful practices. And they did this 30-day challenge that involved like womb meditations and making herbal infusions for yourself for the different phases of your cycle. And from those 30 days, my entire world changed. Like I learned that I was cycling all the time. I learned that people collect their blood and give it back to the earth and that they love their blood. I learned about yoni steaming, which if anyone doesn't know, it involves steaming your vaginal tissues to bring warmth and blood flow to it. And it's also a deeply spiritual practice. The first time I yoni steamed, actually, I like created this entire ceremony for myself. And well, let me back up a little because I did this whole thing. But the intention for it was like, I need to touch my vagina. Like that was like the intention still was like, how can I get to this place of like touching myself? And I, at the same time, like simultaneously to finding this group, I had hired a coach separate from them who had also come up on an Instagram ad for me. And she was really into like sexuality and also yoni steaming and different things like that. And so we did coaching calls, and my whole thing was like, how come I can't touch my vagina? What's going on? And she like walked me through it through a few sessions. Her name was Megan. Her Instagram is Blooming Wombs, I think, if it's still that. I don't think she does a lot anymore either, but back then she changed my life. And she talked me through some of it, like understanding the mind body aspect. And then at one point she was like, well, what if your yoni doesn't want to be touched right now? Like, have you ever asked her? Like, have you ever asked her permission? And like, God, I mean, I hadn't, like I had been going into trying to go into this relationship with my body with force and with this, like,
Mm.
I have to just like put my finger in. Um, and her just saying that to me, like, I can't tell you how grateful I am because it softened me in a way that I didn't know like I needed to be softened. And that's how yoni steaming dropped in for me. She was like, well, why don't you just sit and maybe put a mirror to your yoni and just look at her, and maybe you just sit on the steam and let the gentleness of that steam soften your tissues and begin to develop a relationship with her. And so the first time I set up a yoni steam for myself, I did it in my bathroom because I didn't have like a setup or anything. And so I set the pot like in the toilet and sat on the toilet, which actually is like a great way to do it if you don't have a setup and you want to sit and be comfortable. You just set the pot like on top of the water and then put the seat down and sit with your big skirt. And I had made the whole bathroom a sanctuary, like incense and flowers and crystals and candles. And I even like wore like a like beautiful dress. And I sat on that steam that first night for like an hour and I just sobbed. Like I just sobbed. Um, realizing how disconnected I had been from this part of my body for so long, and like the people I had allowed to enter into this body of mine without me like thinking about if that's what I really wanted, right? Like lack of just consciousness around how sacred my body was. And yeah, for the next 2 years, so from 2020 to 2022, I excitedly, diligently, devotedly learned about my cycle and learned to love my period, even with crazy cramps. I yoni steamed consistently. I began going to women's circles from that group Yoni Temple School. I ended up hiring one of them as a coach and doing like yoni sunning and womb dancing and all of these like wild things that are accessible when you live in Southern California. And it wasn't until and I totally let go of this idea that I needed to put my finger inside my yoni. And I just connected with all these other layers of my womb story and my cycle, and truly just became in love with like my period. Like that was a big thing that dropped in, is just like looking at my blood with such like awe and reverence. And it was in 2022, probably early 2022, that again, I found another woman on Instagram. Thank God for Instagram. And her name was Jasmine. I think her name on Instagram now is Jasmine Rose. And she's wonderful. And she was leading these workshops called Rooted, that were internal massage practices for women. And she was leading them on Zoom, but everyone would have their cameras off. And she would guide you into this like ceremonial space of bringing your hands to your body. And so one day I got up the courage to sign up for one. I asked my partner at the time to leave the house and give me my space, and he did. And I set up this really sacred space for myself. And she began the practice with like, you're massaging your breasts and you're massaging your womb, and then you're coming down really gently to like the outer lips. And she would always say, like, if you don't feel like you can enter into this next layer of like going to the inner lips or going to the vaginal entrance, like it's okay. Just be with where you are and you can stay, somewhere else. And so for most of the practice, I stayed sort of like just on the outside of the opening to my yoni. And eventually she said something. I can't remember exactly what it was. But I just tried it, and I put my hands inside my own body, and I felt nothing but just like love and peace and groundedness and acceptance. Like it was probably one of the most profound moments of my life. I felt like I had just like come home to myself. And I sobbed. I just sobbed. And I, like with joy and with like, oh my God, like it was never about like needing to do this thing. It was about like cultivating the connection within myself to
Mm.
feel so comfortable with my body and to like be able to explore. And it came from a place of curiosity, not a place from like, this needs to happen. Yeah, I think I'll pause there because that was a big story.
Well, what you just said at the end there, like it was never about needing to do this thing. It was about the process of the unfolding and being soft and patient with yourself and coming from a place of curiosity instead of like, this has to happen or else whatever. That just feels like such a big metaphor for anything in life and just a
Mm,
reminder for these deep desires that we have and maybe sometimes we don't even understand. You talked about when you first started saying like I need to like touch my vagina. Why can't I touch my vagina? And people would ask you like why do you need to do that? And you were like
yeah.
sometimes we don't even need to understand, there is some mysterious thing going on in the background, but it's like when yeah, it's so beautiful that you learned through that process and in such an intimate and embodied way that you so could have easily just like brushed that off and then just gone your whole life like being a woman
Mm-hmm.
who is totally disconnected from her body and can't touch her vagina. Like that is
Yeah.
I think that is the more common story. So I just find it so fascinating that yeah, that's just like it has to be who you are, like who you were born to be, was this like deeper calling that was
Mm-hmm.
kind of like whispering and magnetizing you towards like come explore this, come explore this. And even when you would come up ahead of like, I'm just imagining that you're hearing this like come explore this and then you're like okay and then you're like you try to go and then it's like no, that's not the way. That's not the way to do it, but you're still hearing this call and you really took the time and like went on your whole journey and how beautiful that you were in Southern California during that time and stumbled upon all these beautiful women on Instagram that really walked that journey with you.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's really beautiful and I think it's a lesson and bigger message for the way that we approach some of our deepest desires in our life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I like what you said too. So I think that the nudges that we get in whatever form they might be, like that sort of inclination I had to continue exploring this relationship with my yoni and with my womb, and that I like needed to do that. Like, of course, that's not random, and not everyone is gonna be so fixated on that. And I think I'm just really grateful that I had the like presence and on some level trust, though I don't know if I would have called it trust back then. I think maybe it was that stubbornness that I alluded to that runs in my family that like I'm gonna do this. I can do what I want. Um, but to follow that, it's I often think I don't know where this like idea comes from, but there's a common idea that like the things that you go through in life, like the hardships or the trials that you go through are like the medicine that you then have to share with others. And
Mm.
I mean, that's definitely rang true for me through my experiences of like learning to come home to my body and find safety there because I mean, that's really what it is to find like a home. And I really find a lot of home in my womb and in my yoni, even on a very physiological level. Like to this day, when I try to like, I mean, I try to like a couple times a month, it doesn't always happen, do like an internal touch practice. And every time I do, it's like nothing is more grounding than that. It's like, oh, okay, like I'm home. Like any sort of anxiety, overthinking, whatever, it's just like gone. And I mean, it's the same with yoni steaming. I get the same sort of groundedness and like, it's like I reclaimed my time and my way of being by living in alignment with my cycle and by like and it's also too it's almost just like reclaiming womanhood. Like this is how we were meant to be as women, like to live in alignment with our cycles, but unfortunately we live in a culture that is on a male hormonal rhythm. And so it really is quite an active reclamation to be living in tune with like what's happening internally on the level of female physiology and the female experience.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so beautiful and just so fitting for you, so perfect. It something about it just feels perfect. Just watching, witnessing my little, I've known you for just a couple of years and in a kind of distanced way, but everything I've gotten to witness and now to hear, go back and hear your, more of your full story. And also, we were on the call together where we shared and planted our dream seeds for what we were calling in this year and like where we're headed. So for me to have a little glimpse of where you're headed, yeah, perfect is just the word.
Oh, thank you.
And it's
Yeah.
also so beautiful because I mean not to water it down, but all you're really doing is just being you, you know?
Totally. No, that's totally it. And that's, I mean, that's like a big intention of mine this year. So every year I pick a word of the year. I've been doing this since 2015, I think, when I graduated high school. I graduated high school in 2015. And that's like kind of an interesting story too. I like had just gone through my first breakup with my high school boyfriend who had moved. At the time I was living in Massachusetts and he was actually moving to California like a semester early because he was going to start this like tech company at age 17 or whatever. And I was so heartbroken. And I wanted to leave everything and move to California with him, which is funny because I ended up moving to California on my own volition. But I was heartbroken, and lost, and young love really hits you. And I was like kind of entering into my hippie era at the time. I was super into like Birkenstocks and getting into yoga and like I don't know, just like very like a surface level spirituality. And so I would go to this metaphysical shop and a woman there, I was buying these tie-dye pants for myself as like a gift. And this woman there, I was like telling her about all of my like relationship woes as a 16, 17-year-old. And it was close to the new year. And she was like, well, instead of overwhelming yourself with like all of this stuff, like I just pick one word or phrase every year. And I allow that to guide me. And man, that woman at, I think it was called like Blue Dragonfly or something, the store in Massachusetts. Um, she changed my life in that moment too. I think
Mm,
it's so interesting the people that we encounter that like plant something within us that changes our life. And that first year, my phrase was find peace. And then the year after that, it was be more present. That was a good one. And yeah, I kept going. And this year, what I was getting to is my word is freedom. And what I've been exploring over, it's January 30th and we're recording now. And so over the past month, I've been exploring like what does that really mean to me? Like what really is freedom mean to me? Like what am I wanting to cultivate with this word? And a big part of it, I think, is the freedom to be myself, like to be myself like unashamedly and fully and to allow myself to take the leaps and the risks that are like coming from my heart and my womb and not necessarily like from my logical mind. And yeah, that's a really cool feeling to be like, yeah, I'm actually free and I can actually choose whatever I want to do. And like 10-year-old Natalie said, I can do what I want.
yes. It is always funny to look back and, we obviously we grow over time and but really we're just becoming more of ourselves and it's yeah, it's so cute to look back and just realize like, oh wow, I was already this and then I kind of got lost somewhere along the way and like had to make my way back, but it's so sweet to just to see you like just returning back to 10-year-old Natalie. Don't
Yeah,
tell me what to
so
do and I can do what I want.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's liberating and to be yourself.
Yeah.
It is quite simply just that. And it is like a reclamation of self to do that. Like it's a reclamation of your life as your own. Like that's been a big theme for me lately is like, this is my life. And it like I know it sounds so simplistic, but like no one can tell you what to do with your life. And like there are no limits. There actually are no limits. Like you could actually make any choice you want to make. Like even we were talking about this about how I was saying, I'm at the point in my business where I'm like responsible and there's people who depend on me, like women who are receiving a lot from me and whose lives are being changed because of my teachings. And that's a really interesting place to be in because it's both wild and beautiful and amazing, but it's also like it puts a little bit of pressure and you can't just like right. So I'm saying like you can't just drop off, but like technically I could. Like that's a choice I could make and
Yeah.
just like leave all those people hanging. And I wouldn't make that choice, at least not right now. But like it's kind of crazy and cool to think that I could actually make whatever choice I want to make. And I don't think that most of the world operates from that place. I think there's a lot of victim mentality, and that's a whole other topic. But there's a lot of like, well, this is just what you have to do.
Hmm.
Um, and I was definitely in that for a long time. Like, even just like after college, being like, oh, well, I just have to get this like job. And I only worked in a corporate job for 2 years because I couldn't stand it. Um, I guess I didn't have as much of a dose of it as some people do. I've always kind of had a low tolerance for things that aren't true to me. But yeah, it's interesting that we actually can choose whatever it is we want from life, even if the whole world thinks that it's absolutely insane.
Yeah. And I would say that that notion that we can't has really been like pounded and beaten into us. So I do understand why most people don't find that to be true, but it is so liberating. And it's something that I forget often because I do come from a tendency of people pleasing and
Mhm.
doing things like I really went on my whole journey of discovering what I didn't even know what I wanted to do. I was
Mhm.
that disconnected and a lot of the things that I was doing was just what other people wanted me to do and maybe not even that, maybe just what I thought other people wanted me to do. Um, so when I kind of like start drifting away from that knowing and then I have these moments in time where I just remember that, oh, I can do whatever I want. Like whatever I want. It's so awesome. It's
Yeah.
literally just feels like I should just throw a party. Like it feels like I'm throwing a party like inside my body with, all the little cells and microorganisms in there. And it's like we can do whatever we want. Like
That's so cute. I love that visual. I need to visualize that more often. Internal party happening. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too because it brings up like another thought for me that I was actually just having this conversation with someone like 2 nights ago or maybe last night even about like the idea of that like free will versus like our soul's purpose and that being like perhaps sort of a pre destined thing. And so I've been kind of playing with that like balance because I do believe I could do whatever I want. Like I believe that if I decided to stop eating well and decided I wanted to eat McDonald's for every meal and fast for 10 hours a day and lay on the couch and watch 5 TV shows every single day and yell at people to express my emotions. Like I could do that. However, um, I think my soul would protest very loudly and it would be extremely uncomfortable. And that's the experience I've had for most of my life when things are out of alignment is it's just really uncomfortable. And so I do believe that we can do whatever we want, but on the same level, it's like at what cost?
hmm
And yeah, I mean, there's a lot I could say on that. And one thing is that I think the cycle is like the menstrual cycle is a really great example of like why it's like kind of like, yeah, you can do whatever you want, but like it's might not always be the best idea. Like you could go to do your hardest gym workout on day 2 when you're bleeding and your entire psyche is open and you're super vulnerable and permeable. But like that's not actually going to be good for you. Or like you could use tampons, you could all of these things, right? But like the cycle is an interesting one because I think a lot of women might hear the teachings of the cycle and be like, well, isn't cyclical living just a way to limit myself? And I totally get that because it is a system. But the thing about it that I think is that actually makes it liberating and not limiting is that it's what's already happening within you. It's like not something that you're like putting on yourself, like, oh, well, just these random 5 days I'm supposed to rest and these random other 5 days I'm supposed to like create something. It's not like this like outward system that you're placing on yourself. It's like how liberating to actually step away from this external system that we're in. You could call it patriarchy, you could call it 9 to 5 culture, whatever you want to call it, to step away from that that is actually limiting and placing something on us and step into like how you actually feel day to day. Because if you tune in, like when you're close to your ovulation, if you have a healthy cycle, you're going to feel like you want to do something more social and more creative. If you really tune in those 3 days before your bleed, you probably don't want to go out to dinner with all your friends. You know, it's I think that's actually really liberating. And I think that our cycle can give us a lot of hints too into what's not working in our life. And that's certainly been my experience. When I lived in California, I had this like, it was in 2023. And that was actually when you visited me. I was in like my darkest time. And I don't feel like getting into all of the details of that time yet because it's still kind of recent. But what I will say is every time I got to my premenstrual phase, the luteal phase of the cycle, I felt like I needed to uproot my entire life. Like I needed to like leave everything I'd known and do something completely different. And for a long time, I kind of repressed that. And I was like, oh, I'm just premenstrual. I'm just whatever. I put a label on it. I was like coming into these more patriarchal ideas of like what it means to be a cycling woman and not seeing each season as really sacred. And, you know, because we live in a culture where like the ovulatory energy is revered and that premenstrual energy is like, oh, no, no, like let's let you be away from everyone for that. And let's pretend like that's not happening. And even just the idea that we need to like soothe that energy is kind of weird to me. Like, oh, like calm your inner critic or like meditate or go for a walk. And like, yes, those are healthy things, but like, what if we didn't see it as a problem? Like, what if we didn't see it as a problem that we had this like voice in our head that was like something needs to change, or like this bigger emotional charge, like this bigger version of us. And so that's been a big part of my reclamation journey too, is reclaiming each season of my cycle as sacred, and especially the premenstrual time. Because what I've learned is that energy that's like slightly critiquing you, and it can be really intense. Like some women have a really strong inner critic. I certainly did. But the thing was, here I am sitting here in January of 2025, and I did change my entire life slowly, like one thing at a time over a year and a half. But that voice is quiet now. Like, I don't have that, like, your entire life needs to change. I actually feel like, of course, when I get to my luteal phase, like, there's some bigger emotions, and sometimes there's like, I don't know, what little things that need to shift. Like, ugh, like my dogs need to have a better schedule. I don't know, whatever it might be. Like, you and I always connect on the
Oh,
dogs.
the dogs in the luteal
The
phase.
dogs in the luteal phase is so rough. It's like you need to not exist for like 5 days. Anyways, but that voice that like your entire life needs to change, like that doesn't happen anymore. And I can genuinely say, like, in this moment, my life feels, I feel more joy day to day than I have felt in my entire life right now. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to change their entire life, but often like that reclamation of your cycle, that reclamation of each season of it is sacred, both the building and the breaking down. The first half of your cycle is for building up your sense of self in the world, and the second half of your cycle is for tearing it apart. And you know, some people are like, well, why? Why would I build up just to be broken down? And it's like, well, what, how else are you going to get to the core of who you are to keep learning and then breaking down what's not right? And I think it's like the ultimate reclamation. It's your path to knowing yourself truly and deeply, and that you can do whatever you want, but it's a lot more comfortable to be doing whatever you want that's actually in alignment with your soul's purpose. And we all have one of those.
Yeah, because I would really challenge that. Like, if people see the cycle as limiting, in that example you gave of like going out and doing a crazy hard workout on the first day of your bleed, I would actually really challenge, like, is that what you want? And kind of what we talked about
Hmm.
last night, like, why do you want that? I
Yeah.
like that's probably just a culturally, societally ingrained thing of like go, 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 all the freaking brainwashing of the period tampon commercials of like all the athletes that are like, oh, now like we've updated our tampon technology, so now you can go do synchronized swimming or compete in the Olympics, like do all these things while you're bleeding. And it's like, we don't want that. We don't want that.
No, no, that's not freedom. That ain't it.
Just put a tampon in and you can be a man. Like,
Right? I mean, that's the whole thing is like they're the reclaiming of being a woman. Like that's really the root of it.
yeah. Yeah, before we go any further, I would love if you're open to it. Could you break down the menstrual cycle and like maybe as if you were teaching it to a little girl who has never had one or like hasn't been taught yet? Because I find that so many of us like don't even know that we have a cycle. We just think of like our period.
Yeah.
And people are like, "Oh, I'm on my cycle." I'm like, "You're always on your
Yeah,
cycle."
you're always on your cycle. You're always
Which is,
cycling.
yeah, and something that you said earlier was like how when you were first bleeding when you were younger, like you thought it was so random and you were so out of tune with it. And I just had a memory of like how interesting it was that, and I'll just say this how I'll say it, but it's kind
Hmm.
of confusing because in a way, I was in tune with my cycle because of birth control because the little pack is like that amount of pills and then it
Yeah.
changes to the white pills. And so it's like when you're gonna bleed.
Yeah.
And I almost feel like that is kind of in there on purpose so that kind of distorts. It's like that's not I don't think that that is not that things are better or worse, but it's just interesting to note that okay, I guess at least I knew when I was gonna bleed every
Hmm.
month. But I also think it's more special to just like think that it's random and try to be like figuring it out instead of like having this like metal packet of pills that'll
Mm.
tell you when you're
Hmm.
gonna bleed, or like oh, when I was in my party girl era and the here come the sugar pills falling on the weekend, I'd be like, "Oh, I'm not gonna bleed. I'm just gonna start my next pack and like skip my period,
Mm.
and I'll wait till Monday and start it or something." Like, but that was just a thought that I wanted to share that is interesting, and I wonder if that is intentional, with the companies that make those. It's kind of like a little mind trick.
Mm. Yeah, like disconnecting you from like the wildness of it in a way.
Yeah, and kind of tricking you to think like, no, you're in tune with your body. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, God, birth control's a
yeah.
topic in and of itself. But yes, I can break down the cycle. So I think this the seasonal lens is like a really great way to teach it to girls. And so that's what I'll share here as like the most basic way to understand it. So day one of your cycle is the first day that you start bleeding. And when you're bleeding, that's your inner winter. So the menstrual phase is inner winter, and that will last for however days you're bleeding. Now, I should say when I talk about this stuff, there's sort of the energetic lens of the cycle, and then there's like the biological lens of the cycle. So the way that I talk about it, it's kind of meshing in the two, because when I talk about like the ovulatory phase, I'm using air quotes, ovulation is a moment in time. And so there's not actually like a whole week that you're ovulating. Like ovulation is just, it happens, right? But there's like an energetic sort of signature around these times. So you can generally think of each phase energetically lasting about a week, though, of course, biologically, it's going to be different, just to share that. So, yeah, menstruation, your inner winter, that's like the first day you start bleeding. It doesn't count like spotting, like that, those couple days that maybe you might spot before your period if you're dealing with that. But it will be those days of blood and your inner winter. And so it's your inner winter, like the same rules, I don't know, the same principles apply to your inner winter as outer winter. So when we think about the season of winter, it's like you're resting, right? Like There's not a lot. I mean, in our culture, there's like a lot of gatherings and stuff, but just thinking of nature, like nature is resting. Things aren't blooming. They're not like growing. They're just in hibernation, like animals go into hibernation. And it's really a time of visioning. So your menstrual time is a time to rest and just receive the visions because that's going to set you up for what you're going to create in your next cycle. And resting on your period also sets you up to have solid energy throughout the rest of your cycle. I was just talking to someone on my podcast about this yesterday. Like, people think when you rest on your period, like, how are you going to get anything done? Like, aren't you going to be less productive? But I actually find living cyclically, I'm more productive than I've been in my entire life. Like, what I've been able to accomplish in the past 2 years and like growing my business and like making things happen for myself because of following my cycle's rhythm is wild. I never would have thought I could be this productive. So that's your inner winter. It's all same things as winter apply. Eat soup and drink hot drinks. Don't have cold things. Wear socks, like that's what you do. And then eventually you'll start to feel like the whispers of spring, like we do in the outer world, where like things start to pop up. And that's our follicular phase. So that's when like the follicles are being recruited and, your body's like getting ready to ovulate. So it's sort of a transitionary time between menstruation and the moment of ovulation when your energy is building and estrogen is rising. So you're going to feel generally pretty good in this phase. Sometimes the tendency is to jump in really quick, and Sydney and I always have this conversation of like titrating the energy and not jumping in like 2 feet first. So like one intention I have for myself lately is to really take a couple days after my bleed. So maybe like day 5 and 6, or day 6 and 7 even, to like sort of just slowly enter back into the world. So rather than like doing all my laundry and checking all my emails and going right back into a full day, I'll kind of like ease back into my life, doing a couple things, adding it in slowly. But it's a great time to be social. All the same things as spring apply. There's like a sensual energy, a playfulness, and excitement. It's like I always like to call my friends in this phase of my cycle and like have long chats, send Sydney a 10-minute voice note. Like, it's great. And then eventually, if you've really nourished yourself well, you'll get to the point of ovulation. And that's important to note because the building of yin, so like that substance, is what triggers ovulation. Yin transforms into yang, and that's your inner summer. So that's the peak of your energy. It's like our bodies look the best, like physically, we're more beautiful in that phase of our cycle. It's like the best time to do something really outward facing. And in this phase of your cycle, you also want to create. So ovulation, right, is like the moment where you could get pregnant in your cycle. And for any woman, like being able to get pregnant is a sign that you're healthy. So it's important to note that like even if you don't want to get pregnant, you should still be able to. And this is the time when like you want to be creating something if you're not creating a baby. So we're not going to be creating a baby every cycle, but the energy in our body is the energy of creation. And if we don't create something, even if it's small, like even if it's just like a shift in your self-care routine that you like stay committed to and like you finally actualize it in this ovulatory window, or like a new women's circle that you attend or start, or a project that you put out into the world at this time. Like we need that energy to be completed because then what happens is we enter into inner autumn, our luteal phase or the premenstrual time, which on a biological standpoint is the longest phase of the cycle. Like you're going to be in that energy the longest. And like I said in my story earlier, like the inner critic, her natural home is in this phase. And that's because there's the natural breaking down. So those first two phases of the cycle that I spoke to, or I spoke to menstruation first, but follicular and ovulatory, inner spring and inner summer, it's that building up of your sense of self. So you're like getting the courage to become who you are and putting yourself out there. And then when you get to the luteal inner autumn time, that gets broken down. And I mean, that's happening on a biological, physiological level in your body too, right? Your lining is getting ready to shed and break down. And so there's this kind of like, my teacher, Nancy Lucina, says it's like rose colored glasses get ripped off in that second half of your cycle. Like the way that you were seeing the world with this sense of like anything is possible. All of a sudden you're like, actually, it's not. And actually, I have needs, and actually, I need to slow down and rest. And actually, this isn't what's working. And there's sort of this like sharpness to you. There's less like floaty, airy energy and more of the like sharp, this is who I am, no bullshit. And sometimes the inner critic can come up strong here, especially if you didn't create something in ovulation. Whereas if you did create something, you can still hear the inner critic, but you can be like, hey, inner critic, like, I hear you. But also, like, remember, I did this. And like, I know I'm not perfect yet, but like, none of us are. And this is what I've accomplished, and this is what I'm moving towards. And then it's like, I mean, it's a cycle, right? So it all has this like downstream roundabout effect where then if you are able to really meet that inner critic, once you get to menstruation, you can actually rest and not still be in that like negotiating with the inner critic, trying to work out your boundary issues in a time when you're supposed to rest and rejuvenate. So the cycle is like this way that we can live in tune with what's already happening in our bodies on a biological level that also is energetic for us too. Like the way that men move through a day on a 24-hour clock, we move that through that in a month. And it's really important to note that it's like totally normal if you have a day where you feel like resting all day, and then you have another day where you feel like you don't want to do any self-care, you just want to be hanging out with friends. Like I will tell you, my self-care goes out the window when I'm ovulating, and it's fine. Like it's not supposed to be like a slow time. So I think that can bring a lot of peace. What I've heard women say when they receive this information and what I felt was I was like, oh, so there's nothing wrong with me? Like there's nothing, like these 2 weeks in my cycle where I don't feel like hanging out and I feel like, oh, like what am I doing with my life? There's nothing wrong with me. Like how liberating.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I feel like that's going to be so important for so many women to hear.
Oh yeah, it's like the biggest life shift ever. Changed my life
Yeah.
completely.
Yeah. And I also just want to say that maybe don't expect that you just heard Natalie say that and then like your whole life is going to shift, tomorrow or next month. I
Yeah.
think that when we are shifting to be more in tune with our cycles, it does happen slowly and gently
Hmm.
over time. And like
Yeah.
I think Natalie said earlier, you make little changes each cycle. Maybe you said that earlier. Maybe that was just an earlier conversation me and you've had, but like you're not trying to just change everything all at once because that's never
No.
sustainable no matter what kind of life changes or lifestyle changes you're trying to make. It really happens in the slow and intentional small choices.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And well, and that's something I really do very intentionally is like I I pick like one thing I want to shift each cycle. Like I make my little cycle calendar each month that I think I shared with you. But like I have like one self-care goal each month, and then I have like my business kind of goal of the month. And like I was telling a friend this recently who I went on a walk with, who was like trying to like change her life. Basically, she's not happy with her life and she's trying to change it. And she was in a similar place as I was a few years ago where she was like, everything needs to change. And I was like, okay, well, it can, but like you can't do it all at once. And so I was remembering, like, we were talking about nourishment. And I was like, yeah, 1 month, my sole self care goal was hydration. Like, that's how specific I get with it. Like, I just focused for that entire cycle on, like, how can I be more hydrated? And then another cycle, maybe I focus on, like, how can I regulate my blood sugar? And those are like my more like health based goals. There's obviously other things too. But yeah, it's like one thing at a time. And that's the vision you get at menstruation. Usually at menstruation, you get that like kind of instructions for the next cycle if you slow down enough to hear them.
Oh yeah, we were just talking about this the other day, but for me it is
Yeah.
really like being when I'm bleeding, it really feels like I'm in conversation with God, with
Mm,
Source, with the Great Mother, the goddess.
yeah.
And I was just talking to my niece about this a few days ago, and it was just funny because obviously she's 12 and I'm 29, and I'm just telling her, I'm like, it's kind of like a practice, it's a ritual, our cycles and our bleeds. And I'm like, you might get to the point where, and she's so in tune already, like
It's so
if I was
amazing.
that if I was that in tune at 12, like I can't even imagine like but what I get to experience now at 29, is being in this like deep devotion to my body, my cycle, my blood, and my relationship with the divinity, and having conversations and receiving downloads and messages and during that bleed and then deciphering them and playing around with, yeah, it's this beautiful relationship that really connects me to everything. I think that is what getting in tune with your cycle is like plugging into this all of everything.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the cycle is our deepest spiritual practice as women. Like, it's actually the basis of how yeah, practice spirituality, And it's like, it's cool because it's so simple. Like, it's just literally what's happening to you day by day. Um, but like a cool way to think of it too, that I think just reminds women and girls of like how magical it is like our blood is like in Chinese medicine, the blood carries emotion, it carries memory. And when we think about it, like this blood is like carrying everything we've experienced for that cycle and it's like bringing it down and out. And then if we can develop a relationship with our blood, which has been a really important reclamation healing part of my journey, is to like look at my blood and to place a jar of it on my altar and then to return it to the earth at the end of each bleed. And when we're doing that, it's like we're connecting ourselves with Mother Earth. Like we're putting our DNA and all of our experiences that we've been through and putting it into the soil. Like to me, it's just like, whoa, like what is more spiritual than that? And even there's a Sanskrit word, urtu, it's RTU. And that's, I mean, when you think about urtu, it sounds kind of like ritual, right? And but what urtu means in Sanskrit is like menstruation. And so a lot of people would call menstruation like the original ritual. And there's so many stories of that, like
Mm.
stories of like the goddess worship and how women used to gather in the red tent with goddess statues and like bleed onto the earth together on the new moon. And I mean, it's just talk about reclamation. I know I keep saying that word because it's your podcast name, but it's like talk about reclamation of like what it is to be a woman as a conduit of like heaven and earth.
Yeah. Yeah, the visual I'm getting for some reason is, the movie Avatar, like the one with the blue people.
The blue people,
Like,
yes.
well, when they like take their tail thing and they connect it to that tree.
Oh, yeah.
That just is like the visual I get of like like giving your blood back to the earth, and it's like you're
Yeah.
pouring it into the mother and then you're just like zoom like
Yeah, totally. Totally. Oh my God. I mean, when you think about it, like, because I'm a very like spiritual person and I can be kind of like floaty, but I also am like very grounded and I like to know how things work practically. Like I have that to me too. And so when you think about like sometimes I tell people like menstruation is psychedelic and they're like, "What are you talking about?" Right? And it's like, well, if you think about it, like your cervix is opening at menstruation and like your cervix is the opening to your womb. And like, I'm sorry, but like we bring beings from wherever beings come from to this earth through our wombs. So like having an opening to that during menstruation, of course it's psychedelic.
that will
Yeah.
just never like cease to just absolutely blow my mind and my heart and my spirit, just thinking that, yeah, we a man and a woman have sex and like some soul, some being is called in, and this like a woman grows that baby in her body and she grows a whole new organ and to
Yeah.
sustain and connect that baby to her, and then she births it out
And we're all
through
just like,
her.
yeah, that's normal.
Yeah, one of my friends is pregnant, and I was just talking to her the other day and she was just talking about how she needs to rest more and how she was like saying, society, the culture, people say that pregnant women need to rest more and slow down and take care of themselves, but then they still have to pay bills and they're still expected to, like, you need to rest more, but also keep doing everything you were already doing. And we had this conversation. I was like, everyone else, that's not pregnant should be like sitting at the pregnant women's feet, like waiting on them hand and foot, because these women
Yeah.
are like, you're continuing the species. They're doing the
Yeah.
most important work,
Yeah.
like ever, literally. That's what
Yeah.
our whole goal is as animals, is to reproduce
Yeah.
and like keep our
Yeah.
species alive. And we treat like pregnant women and mothers are just so under supported and under resourced.
Hmm.
And she's right. Like I mean, I hate to say we, but I'll just say we, even though we aren't doing this. We do expect these women to like take care of yourself, like do all of these things, but also like you still need to make dinner and take care of your whole family and keep going to your job and take care of your community and go do all your errands and blah blah blah. Like make sure the world keeps running, but also like, take it easy, rest, you're growing a baby. It's like, what? You can't. How about someone else steps up and says, "Hey, let me take care of you so that you can
Yeah.
rest. Let me take this
Yeah.
off your plate so that you can rest." Like that
Yeah.
is just a vision of a more beautiful world that I see is where we really treat and support pregnant women,
Yeah.
where they're uplifted and held and cared for in their communities, pregnant women and mothers.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I mean, it's like kind of crazy to me that that's not what we do. Um, yeah, I have a friend who's pregnant, and we were voice messaging the other day, and we were just updating each other on our lives. And I was like telling her, I was like, yeah, these are like, I'm going to do a retreat this year and run this program, and I'm going to the gym more and going on hikes and all this stuff. And she was like, I think she's 21 weeks pregnant. And she was like, wow, like I'm not doing any of that. And I responded back to her and I was like, I'm sorry, you're growing a human.
Yeah.
I was like, you're doing a lot. And I mean, it's you can even relate that to like menstruation in a way of like, you know, a pregnant woman, it might not seem outwardly like she's doing a lot and expending a lot of resources, but that's happening internally. And it's the same with menstruation. It's like, yeah, of course you're so tired. Like internally, so much is shifting and changing within you. And so I think that's, an important understanding is to like honor what the internal energy is doing and not just like what's seen externally.
Yeah, and I also think that reorienting your life to be in tune with your cycle would be a great way to prepare for pregnancy and
Hmm.
would already be kind of in tune with your womanly nature so that you would either already have your life oriented so that it would be different and you would be able to rest and take care
Yeah.
of yourself in the ways that you need to when you're pregnant, or at least you would be familiar with how you need to reorient in order to step into that phase of womanhood.
Definitely. I think it's the blueprint. There's a quote, and I can never remember where it comes from. It's like a Native American prophecy, or no, not prophecy quote, but it's at menarche, which is a first bleed, the girl meets her power. Throughout all her cycling years, she practices her power, and then it ends with at menopause, she becomes her power. But the practicing part is really important to me because that is what it is. And like that second like blood mystery, as we call them, after your first bleed is postpartum. And I think that really every menstruation is an opportunity to practice for postpartum and to like set yourself up for success. And that's actually how I got into cycle work, partly my own journey, of course, but it was also like I was attending births as a doula and being like, I was also teaching prenatal yoga and trying to like coach these women to like get in tune with their bodies. And of course, you can learn how to get in tune with your body for the first time when you're pregnant, but it's way easier if you've had that blueprint and you like understand and trust your body's cycles and your womb's rhythms already.
Yeah. Yeah. I know we've already been talking a lot about what you're reclaiming in this life, but I still want to ask you, like, if you have one main message or if there's anything specific you want to hone in on what you are reclaiming as sacred.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I feel like it's really just that the path of being a woman is sacred in and of itself. That like this archetypal journey that we move through each month and throughout our larger life cycles, which I didn't fully get into, but you also go through these like energies throughout your entire life cycle from like girlhood to motherhood to like what we call the sorceress, that like perimenopausal, menopausal sacred time that matches the luteal phase, and being a crone and an elder. And so as women, we get to move through these like mini cycles every month. And then we also move through these larger life cycles. And I think in our culture at large, the archetypal path and the sacred path of womanhood has been really ignored and also like repressed and pushed down and like silenced. And so it is a huge part. I mean, my entire soul's mission here, I feel, to reconnect women with the sacredness of their cycle and being a woman. Um, and that's what I'm reclaiming for myself too, is how sacred it is just to exist in this female body.
Yeah. I love that it is such a reclamation. It really is, taking back something that was stripped away from us, or at least attempted to be stripped away from us, but you cannot take that away from women.
No, it's there.
All right. I mean, I'm trying to think of where to go from here. We've talked about so much. Um, is there anything that you want to talk about that you haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, there's one thing I'll touch on briefly that I think is just important to note because it's something that I've been like, I guess, recently reclaiming, but we don't have time to get super deep into it. I think it goes along though with reclaiming like womanhood and femininity is something I've been really playing with is like also reclaiming like the sacredness of both women and men and their different
Mm,
capacities and like ways they relate to each other. I spent so long, obviously, I shared with you like learning about women, like learning like what it is to be a woman, learning about women's ways and the feminine experience. In the past, like, I'd say like 10 months, I've been trying to learn more about men too, and like men's rites of passage and men's phases of their life, which they exist too. And a great book, if you want to get into that, is called Keys to the Kingdom by Alison Armstrong. And she talks about men's life phases. And I've been really like trying to reclaim the, the just like perfection that it is of women and men both existing in this world. That like women are these like what I've spoken to, like these like channels of like heaven and earth. And then I think that there has been this cultural like repression to an extent of like healthy men. And there's been, this is such a nuanced topic because, of course, there's been like violence from men and there's been like patriarchal problems. But there also has been this like demonization of all men. And what I am starting to see is that men have such a sacred role here too, and that is like to be protectors and providers and to be like I almost imagine it like the woman is just like spinning and spinning and spinning in like her cycle like and the man is just like standing there just like holding everything down so that she can travel all to these places and bring back the visions. And I think that there's a huge disconnect in men and women in our culture, especially in romantic relationships, and a lot of bitterness for not understanding what the other's needs are and like how they can be so different and yet still be so different and not even still, but like be so different and how that is exactly how like magic and alchemy happens. I think there's a lot of like power struggle that goes on between women and men. Um, and so one thing that I guess I would say like I'm currently starting to reclaim is like really honoring and appreciating men for who they are and not who I think that they should be.
mm. Yeah, I know you shared that book with me when you came to visit last year. You started talking to me about it, and I've been on a similar journey, not in the same way of like learning about men and how they work and their rites of passage, but just more so my work has specifically been focused on supporting women and mothers. And I think that's amazing and beautiful and important. And also, it's like we're leaving out the men and the fathers. And not that it's necessarily my role to like be a leader in a man's world. I'm not a man, but also just including the men and inviting the men in a little bit more and being support for fathers too. It's like really the whole family needs that nourishment and nurturance and caregiving. And I think about being, in the birth world and when a family is able to have a birth at home outside of the medical system undisturbed and it is, a mother and a father and they're both there working to bring their child into the world and how that is a rite of passage for a father too. And I think
Mhm.
in the when birth is medicalized and pregnancy is medicalized and the father, I just think of a classic hospital birth and the father is really kind of just like pushed to the corner or
Yeah.
oh yeah, I come in and cut the umbilical cord. Like that is like the father's role and I really think that fathers miss out on that whole initiation into fatherhood. And so to be able to witness the original design of the initiation and that rite of passage into motherhood and fatherhood and parenthood together was really, really beautiful. And just hearing
Mhm.
women's birth stories and when you hear a home birth and they do almost always have a moment where they describe like the role that their partner played and it's like men are so important in birth. They play such a big role in birth. They play such a big role in life and yeah, I mean, we could talk about feminism and how maybe that did, some good things for us, but I also think it did a lot of harm towards men and women
Mhm.
and, force this notion of separation and
Mhm.
anything you can do, I can do bleeding. I think that was like a tagline
God.
and just put us into like a competitive spirit of like women have to prove that we can be better than men at their own game in this way.
Mm.
And I was just thinking about this personally in my life the other day, just kind of some of my cycle reflections. And I've heard women talk about, how their whole family are like, just for us, it's just Shane and I and our dog. So getting the whole family really on that rhythm of your cycle. And I was just like, what does that really look like? Because I feel like in a way, if I'm thinking about it from my perspective, I'm like when I'm in my follicular phase and when, in my ovulatory period, like that is a time when I have more to give
Mhm.
and when I can really like show up for Shane more in supporting Shane and so that he can like be working on what he's doing. And then when I, move into that luteal phase and my bleeding phase, like I think that would be a really beautiful dance to where we kind of like switch and then he can step into that role of putting me first and
Mhm.
making sure my needs and my desires
Mhm.
are met and that I can have my it's this dance of like, being there and supporting each other, but also a lot of it is just about holding space, which I
Yeah.
feel like so much of life is There, there is, of course, there's lots to do. And also, I think that sometimes it's in the not doing when a lot of magic happens and a lot of love
Mhm.
and care
Mhm.
and support is, and where people feel seen is just
Mhm.
by, yeah, just kind of having that dance of what can I do for you when I'm resourced here because we're in a partnership, we're building this life together. And what can you do for me? And then like and maybe that ovulatory phase is a beautiful time where we really come together and we can just be in that energy of togetherness
Mhm.
and create whatever magical. That was just something I was thinking about a couple days ago.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think bringing your like male partners in on your cycle is such a cool practice, and I think it actually like it really helps them to know. um like what I've learned about men from the book and also from like trying out stuff that I learned in the book is like men are really generous. Like they really like to provide. Like that gives them such a sense of purpose, which is interesting. I was just talking to a man recently and I was saying like what do you think that I was explaining that like what I think men give women in relationships is like a sense of groundedness. Like there is something about being in the presence of a healthy man that like my nervous system settles in a different way. And I was sharing that with this man and I was like, what do you think men receive from women? And his immediate answer was like purpose. And I was like, ah, yeah, like a lot of men find a really deep purpose from like serving and providing. And when we like give them the tools to do that and we let them do it, like I think when you talk about the feminist movement, some of that stuff was really important. Like women needed bank accounts, you know, like that needed to be a thing.
Yeah.
But just probably. But I think one thing it did was it, for a lot of women, it caused them to feel like they needed to push away men because they needed to be able to do it all themselves while bleeding, right? Like you said. But that's what creates the disconnect between men and women is because it's really beautiful to let your partner, especially like if you're like bleeding, to like let your male partner support you and step into that provider role and to know that like that's not wrong. And I think also for men, like they like things to be very like the cycle makes sense to them because it's like something they can like logically like, oh, in this
Yeah.
phase she's excited and happy, and in this phase she wants to be alone. Like, cool, got it, you know? So I think it's a beautiful practice, and I think what you said is like probably a really healing thing for a lot of relationships to try out.
Yeah. And I would, for some reason, I feel the need to say, like, sometimes when your partner is not maybe doing something you want them to do or not showing up for you in the way that you wish that they would, it's so silly and simple, but I think as women, sometimes we forget to just like straight up ask them.
Yes, yes. They're just like they have no idea, and we just ask, and it's like, oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's such a thing. And we have to remember that like another thing this book talked about, and whatever, people should read the book, but is like men are single focused, whereas women are multi-focused. And so
Mm,
like you really do have to like, you know, like direct their attention to what the need is if you have a need. Otherwise, like they're going to be focused on the other thing they're focused on. And it's not personal. It's just like and that, I mean, that's why this stuff is so important to me, to like for women to understand that about men, and then for men too to understand the woman's cycle and, you know, the things that there are to understand about women, because I think there really is like a lack of harmonization between men and women in a lot of relationships, just because there's a lack of understanding.
yeah. Yeah. And I would say kind of the flip side to what you first said is like if you want to come to your partner and talk to them about something, at least for me, and I think this is really the way of women, that I have so many things going on in my mind, like all at the same time. And it is like chaos, but it's a little bit of an ordered chaos. Like it makes sense to me. And when I present all of that to my partner, I think sometimes he feels like attacked or just bombarded and just completely overwhelmed, probably just feels like a tidal wave coming at him. So when there is something that we are trying to communicate, like, can we clear out our energy before we go into that conversation with them and get really clear and specific on what we're trying to communicate instead of trying to be like so poetic and speak so beautifully and like in this spiral circle of, and then we're just like, what do you mean you don't get it?
Yeah, no, they just want the details. They want the like the message, not how you got to the message.
Yes, yes. Call
Which is
your,
funny because we love the spiral as women. Like that's
yeah.
so great for us.
I was gonna say maybe like call one of your girlfriends before you talk and just
Yeah,
have that whole, 4 hour undoing, unraveling, and
for sure.
then
And then talk to your male partner.
yeah.
Yeah. That's definitely probably a better way to go about it.
And one thing I love, like even though, we just said like sometimes you just have to ask because they just don't know. There's times when I have like come to Shane and I try to like maybe, for example, like I kind of lash out at him and I just am giving a little bit more sass than is necessary. And then sitting by myself thinking about it. And I'm like, okay, I guess I'll go out and address that. And I got to Shane and I'm like, okay, well, I'm in this phase of my cycle. I'm on this day of my cycle. And so I'm feeling like this. And like, I'm doing the whole over explaining and everything. And Shane will just be like, he's like, I know where you are in your cycle. I pay attention to
Oh.
that kind of stuff. And I'm like, yeah,
Oh.
I think the first time that happened was like sometime last year and it was really sweet. I think I even shared that with
Mm,
you actually. And because
yeah.
it was sweet and it caught me off guard because sometimes I don't even realize the space that he's holding or I don't realize that he is paying attention. And I think that is one of a role that men carry is like they're just holding it down
Yeah.
and they don't have to be like, "Hey, I'm holding it down. Like, can't you see?" Like they're just doing
They're
it.
just doing it. Yeah. Yeah. That's so sweet. I love that. I mean, yeah, I think bringing your partner in on your cycle is it's so special. Like such a way to connect intimately.
And
Yeah.
other men in your life too, I would say. I try to
Mm,
speak more openly now, like with my dad and with my brother about
yeah.
the things I'm going through because, if I'm having conversations with my dad, we talk on the phone every now and then and he's asking how I am and I'm explaining and then like I'll notice a pattern that's like, oh, maybe we're talking every time before my bleed and my in the last few months like I've been having not this isn't current, but the last few months I've been having like, very intense emotions and
Mm.
fluctuations in emotions right before bleeding. And so having that conversation with my dad is like I don't know. There's something that I love about it, and he doesn't really like respond in depth to me, but it's just like I love just being open about it and having that, and I think it does kind of I think we should talk about it.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. It's a gift to everyone because I mean, again, it's just like being in the reality, the truth of your experience and sharing that with other people. And when you are sharing your truth and your reality with other people, that there's no way you can't connect.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just imagine like my dad or my brother, like I feel like sometimes my brother is like what the hell is she talking about? But I have this vision in my mind that maybe like later in time he's like it just gives him a little bit more clued into like, oh, maybe this is why my girlfriend is maybe she's experiencing this too, Like I never thought about it that way.
Mm,
So
totally. I think about it. Yeah, I actually have thought about it that way with like past partners. I'm like, man, their next partner is so lucky I taught them all this stuff.
I trained them well.
Yeah, I trained them well. They're like, red roses because you're bleeding? Oh,
That's
yeah.
amazing. All
Yeah.
right, Natalie, do you want to share one practice or ritual that you have that, I mean, you already shared so many, but
Mm.
one that you want to share that feels really potent and important that reminds you that life is sacred.
Yeah, so interesting. You know, this wasn't what I thought I was going to share when I saw this question, but I think what I want to share is like the simple practice of returning your blood to the earth. Um, it's, you can collect your menstrual blood in like a cloth pad or period underwear and like wring it out in a jar of water. And what I like to do is I'll place it somewhere in my room, often on my altar. If you have an altar, you can do that and look at it, like look at your blood and know that that's been your DNA that's been moving through you all month. And and then when your bleed ends or, whenever you feel called to, you can go to a special place on the earth or even to a plant in your house that's really meaningful to you. And it can be as simple as just saying thank you and pouring your blood onto the earth. And I think the reason that I share that as like a way to connect to the sacredness of life is because for women, like it reminds you that you are earth. That like this, you are connecting your DNA to Earth's DNA. And I don't know how you could not feel like a sacred woman when you're doing that. And I'm sorry for the men, this doesn't apply to you, but for the men, I will say, like connect with your partner's cycle. Like that's going to change your life too. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, where can people find you? Where can people connect with you if you want to share any offerings you have?
Yeah. Okay. I'm pretty active on Instagram. It's at moonbaby_magic. My website is moonbabymagic.com. I offer one-on-one sessions that are focused on like optimizing your cycle and fertility, as well as connecting more deeply with these parts of you. I have an herbal shop. I have a period prep guide. And this year, I'm offering two group programs. The first one is starting in March, and it's about basically all the stuff we've been talking about today. It's called Intentional Maidenhood, which is that phase of your life before you become a mother. And it's really all about like using your cycle as a blueprint to create the life of your dreams. And there is also going to be a retreat in Peru at the end of it. But even if you don't do the program, you're welcome to come to the Peru retreat, which will have cycle teachings and women's circles and a lot of magic. So yeah, you can follow me on Instagram to keep up with all that. I'm always coming up with new things. I love to create and I love to share and I also love to connect. So would love to connect with anyone on there.
Yeah, and also your podcast.
Oh yeah, I don't know why I didn't share the podcast. Yes, I have a podcast. It's called Moon Baby Magic. And on the podcast, I share um, women's rites of passage stories. So there's like first bleed stories, there's birth stories, there's stories of like reconnecting to your body and sexuality and a lot of things along the themes of our womb stories. And you can find it anywhere you find podcasts.
Yeah. Thank you. So epic. So excited to keep seeing what you do and
Mm.
yeah, being a part in the little ways on your podcast. And I mean, your Peru retreat sounds to die for.
Yeah, I'm so excited. It's gonna be epic.
All right, Natalie, thanks so much for coming on. Love you.
Yeah, thank you, Sydney. I love you. Thanks for holding this space. Feels so sweet to be able to be on the receiving end of being interviewed, and you hold immaculate space and ask wonderful questions. So thank you for this creation.
Oh, thank you.